by Ms. Sonia Gaupolai, international relations expert, to insight on this issue. Sonia, welcome once again to BTV News in Context.
Good afternoon, man. Thank you so much for having me.
Absolutely. We are always happy to have you. Now, the G7 summit, I mean, there are so many things that are making headlines right now regarding the G7. But first of all, let's talk about the Pope's address. I mean, he made history for the first time addressing the G7 summit. What are our take-homes from what you were saying there addressing the G7?
Yes, like you were saying, and again, thank you for having me. Like you were saying, we saw a historical attendance and, of course, contribution by the Pope, the first of its kind, at the G7 summit. And, you know, going in, it was understood that his presence there is out of a desire to address the world leaders, the G7 leaders, regarding artificial intelligence, AI. And, you know, a lot of people sort of were surprised in terms of, you know, the Pope, AI, where is the link in that?
Yeah.
I think a lot of people understanding the role of the Pope in the religious and spiritual sense, they sort of expect that his contributions in whatever dialogue would be from that standpoint. But if you look at the things that he had to say, that the Pope had to say about AI, speaking specifically about the morality of using AI within the context of international war, it was quite an important issue, considering that currently we see the world sort of being engaged in war on multiple fronts, more than what has been the case. You know, I think the global infrastructure is sort of at the moment failing to contain different levels of conflict, from escalating into full-blown war, as we see that multiple countries are engaged in actual combat. So the issue of engaging AI in conflict and war, and the moral questions arising from that kind of action were very important. If you look at the issue of, you know, autonomous weapons, the way the Pope went on to say, you know, we should not have a situation where it is up to a machine to decide whether to take a life or not, simply because we know that as a human making that decision, there are moral considerations that you make, whereas where it's left to the action of machinery and or AI, it means its considerations are much different, and the moral question is nowhere featuring when they have to make that kind of decision. So I think the Pope's address was quite important, and it was focusing on an issue that we talk about AI, but not to the extent of what does it mean for the protection of human life as it relates to war and conflicts in international relations.
Yeah, very interesting. AI is always a very interesting topic, because in the end we want to progress with artificial intelligence. But then again, like you're saying, the morality aspect of things. Now, having AI to not be controlled by the human mind, you know, the morality aspect of things is another thing that we really need to take into serious consideration.
Exactly.
Yeah, right. Now, let's also speak about, you know, the decision, the particular $50 billion, you know, this loan to Ukraine. You know, what does it mean, though, when we say we're leveraging the frozen assets as collateral? What does it mean, if you can just briefly just describe or explain that for us?
Well, so what the G7 leaders agreed was that you would remember that in 2022, when Russia launched a full-scale war against Ukraine, that is now, you know, over 2 years old. Countries of the world and of the G7, of course, imposed sanctions on Russia, and as a of sort of a deterrence measure against them continuing with that aggression against Ukraine, and sort of, you know, a punishment for having been in contravention of UN resolutions and law. And of course, we have come to understand that those sanctions have not deterred Russia. As we speak, the war is ongoing. The Russian aggression against Ukraine continues, and, you know, it has accounted for multiple losses of life in Ukraine, as well as the destruction of infrastructure, and generally just the uprooting of the Ukrainian economy. So what the leaders then agreed was, you know, okay, we have sanctioned and frozen Russian assets in the different countries of the G7. What now they want to do is that as those monetary assets sit frozen, as the terminology used. They are bearing interest, right? They are kept in interest-bearing institutions. What then they decided to do was to sort of aid the reconstruction of Ukraine as well its continued defense in the war. They would take the interest that has been borne by these assets and then use that as collateral towards a loan that is given to Russia. So that is given to Ukraine, sorry. So as it stands, the actual assets that are Russian owned remain untouched. What we would call, the principal. Those amounts and those assets remain untouched. What is going to be used in this deal is the interest that is coming out of those assets. And the reason for the assets remaining untouched, because like we're talking about, this is a sort of a watershed arrangement in international relations. So the legality of, in fact, using the actual assets themselves is still something that is yet to be determined. And because Russia is treated as sort of pariah in international relations for the fact that it contravenes international law as and when it pleases. The G7 countries don't want to find themselves in a situation where morally they are acting in the way of Russia, where they also now contravene international law. So that is why the question of these assets has been going on since the start of the war, and even now they are still now skating around and trying to find other issues now that they're saying, the interest. Because the actual assets themselves, the way that it works, they belong to the people or the country which originally owned them, even if they are frozen elsewhere. So that question still remains now, hence this deal is centered around the interest. Yeah.
Absolutely. Now, this deal around the interest, when we speak of precedents, legality aspect of things, we can't help but keep on talking about the legality aspect of things, of this particular issue. Do we see it? Do we see some precedents now existing in this particular area? Have we seen something like this before? And what really will it imply in the future when we have such a decision being made now? What can it, lead towards more decisions coming after this particular one?
Well, the essence of this decision being a watershed arrangement or moment is because of the fact that there really is no proper precedent that can be used to sort of guide this arrangement. And the reason why it needs to be taken as carefully and considerably as it has been is because this is now going to be the benchmark for future action around such issues like this. So they are in essence setting up what should be the benchmark going into the future, and they are taking this long because they themselves now don't really have a case that in terms of the intricacies around it matches what is happening with Ukraine and Russia. And if you look at especially the sort of, in recent times, the sort of accusations that the West and America have been leveled against the West and America in terms of being accused of moral inconsistencies, hypocrisies in the application of international law. It means that decisions such as this need to be carefully considered, because the last thing they need is to act hastily, looking only at punishing Russia in the short term, and then failing to apply whatever principles they would apply now to themselves and their allies in the future. That is why it was a good decision that while waiting to figure out the actual legality regarding the actual assets, it was a good idea to just now focus on the issue of the interest, because with interest, the question of who actually owns the interest is one that is open and can be argued either way. But the ownership of those assets is quite clear. Yeah.
Now, speaking of accusations towards the Western countries, another aspect of things, or the other way one can think of this, is, are we weaponizing funds now? For the fact that we're using these interests to go and fund Ukraine, to keep on buying more weapons that they need for the war, to keep on building new infrastructure. I mean, that is quite needed. We need that and would like that for Ukraine. But what aspect does it bring in relation to the international law now? When we speak of weaponizing, it might be an accusation, it might not stand as an accusation. I mean, yeah, what would you say in that one?
Well, I think for now, considering that the decision has just been made and we are yet to see it in implementation, it would still be sort of early to sort of, I guess, assign ulterior motives to those countries at the moment. What would be interesting is, like I said, in the future, if either of these countries or their allies are in a situation similar to that of Russia, where they engage in military action that for the most part other countries are against. And as a result, sanctions are imposed against them. And then this same approach is then applied. It would be then interesting to see if they will accept it, applied to them the way that it is with Russia. Because I think the problem is that when it comes to the treatment of those countries such as Russia that are considered to be, not as democratic, not as respectful of international rules and norms, it is quite easy to get swayed by the negative perception around those countries, such that you end up employing any and every measure available, but forgetting that you are setting precedent. And then now when it's time to follow those same principles towards a fellow democratic country or a fellow ally, it becomes hard, and that's when now those inconsistencies creep in. So for the moment, we can take it that they are being earnest, and that indeed this is just a way of protecting and aiding a fellow ally in the form of Ukraine. But that remains to be seen as now the loan terms themselves become available to us, and we get to understand the proper ways in which this loan is going to be disbursed, and of course the cost of the individual members themselves. Because if you look at countries of the EU at the moment, they are at a point where domestically they have a lot of issues that are bubbling within their countries, and issues such as aiding Ukraine monetarily. It's a sore topic. That's why even after this deal, the Italian Prime Minister kept on emphasizing that this loan will not be financed by the taxes of the European people, because they're at a point where the burden of carrying the Ukraine struggle is really weighing down on the citizens of most of these European countries. So it's going to be interesting to see the proportions that are going to be allocated between these G7 countries to total the 50 billion. And if indeed, as per the promise of the Italian minister, the EU citizens will not feel the brunt of it, because so far it is the reason for their discontent with continuing to defend Ukraine.
Yeah. Now you also mentioned something there. Now, speaking of Russia, now getting into Russia's field right now at the moment, G20, G7, G8 with Russia. I mean, what do we think is their standing right at this moment? Will this, worsen tensions between the G7 countries and Russia? What are we going to see from this particular decisions, from our own expectations, and even as we see forward?
Definitely, I think the biggest problem with this deal is that one, it paints a picture of not being any closer to an actual ceasefire, right? If Ukraine is being funded to sort of put up more of a fight, not saying that that's wrong, but it means that there is going to continue fighting for the considerable future. And with Russia, I think the one thing we've come to understand and expect with Russia when it comes to decisions that are taken regarding them is retaliation. And indeed, even just a day after this intention was announced, the Russian officials made it clear that there would be retaliation. At the moment, stating that they would then also impose sanctions on companies and citizens of Europe, of these European countries, in Russia. And you know, according to them, the amount that they are in a position to freeze belonging to Europe is almost equal to the amount in Russian assets that has also been frozen. So with Russia, it's an issue of retaliation in kind in terms of the sanction, but of course also more resolve in terms of the war, because it means that you know, they respond in kind. If Ukraine is being aided to put up more of a fight, it means Russia puts up even more of a fight themselves to sort of weaken whatever measures Ukraine put in place. So I think for me, the biggest problem that I have with this resolution is not that Ukraine is being helped to rebuild and put up a defense. For me, it's just a disappointment that it means we can expect this war to continue into the foreseeable future. And I think it's indicative of the fact that as world leaders continue talking about issues of war, because they are not exactly on the ground, it's easy to forget that as we talk, there are people that are on the ground losing lives, right? So it becomes sort of something that is now done in front of the cameras in Italy, where the summit is. And for me, these continued conversations and trying to bolster deals, they are not unnecessary, definitely not. But because of the context in which they happen, I think they sort of remove the actual humanitarian aspect of war from some of these leaders, right? So I appreciate the arrangement, I appreciate the deal, but just looking into the future, that it's been over 2 years now, and it will be almost 3 years it will be 3 years in a couple of months, and when you look at it, there's the prospects of actual peace and a ceasefire are quite far off. I'll even remind you that, you know, right after the summit, we had the Ukraine peace summit as well, where, you know, 92 countries converged to talk about the Ukrainian war, but Russia was absent from that summit, and there is no how a peace deal can be brokered between two parties in the absence of one of those parties, right? So it means that all these things now are sort of becoming a talk shop, where leaders from this, then the third, they converge at some fancy place, they talk about war, but there is not an actual personal effect on them of the war that they speak about, right? Yeah, so I think for me that's the disappointment that I have, but of course we can't really run away from politics and, you know, bargaining when we talk about these issues. But yeah, the loss of life aspect, it's quite disheartening when you look at it.
Yeah, you know, so when they sit in the comfortable offices and in the conference, you know, they're not feeling the bombshells dropping on them at that moment. So it's quite unfortunate, like from what you were saying. But let's also continue to talk about this particular loan, and it's a loan, right?
Yes.
And so what are the implications? What are the things that can come up if there be any conflicts that could arise? Either from this stage right now, thinking of how we will consolidate the 50 billion, and also what happens if in due time Ukraine fails to repay the $50 billion?
Well, it's going to be, the arrangement is that in the event that Ukraine is unable to repay the loan, that's where the interest comes in, right, as collateral. But another scenario could be that, remember, the interest being born out of these assets are functions of the market. There could arise a situation where, in fact, these assets depreciate as a functioning of the global markets, where now they will be bearing net negative interest as opposed to appreciating. And it's going to be interesting that, having had these leaders commit and promise to their citizens that you will not be paying for this loan. What then happens when the very interest that is being relied on to cushion Russia as Ukraine as collateral, if there is no such interest to speak of at the time when the loan is due, it means that they would need to then talk about actually having the countries themselves pitch in. So it would be interesting to see how that comes around. And like I said, the European citizens as well as the American citizens are at a point where the actions of the foreign policies of their countries are starting to weigh heavily on them. We might see that at that point, if the countries need to come in and pay, that might be the what do they call it, the final straw for those citizens. So those are just some of the dynamics that may come up going forward in terms of how this deal of theirs is structured. It's based on interest that might not be there at the time when it is needed. Yeah,
absolutely. Right. And now this makes us wonder, like from what you were saying there, the global financial system, how is it going to be affected? I mean, when we speak of wars, obviously the economy is affected, globally. It's affected from country to country. Right now in Botswana, we know we are being affected by that war some way, somehow. So this particular decision, how do we expect it to affect the financial system thereof? Now we're speaking of interest, we're speaking of loans, we're speaking of so many things that come into play there. What do we think this is going to form as a precedent when we speak of the financial system?
Well, I think in terms of affecting the markets directly, there is no reason to believe that this deal in isolation would cause any immediate shock to the markets, because like we're saying, we're talking about the 7 biggest economies here in the world. So they are definitely more than good to put together a 50 billion loan package without descending themselves into any type of economic turmoil. But like I said, in terms of precedent, the issue of sanctions and the resultant assets, it's going to be this deal is going to now feature more going forward in conversations relating to issues of sanctions and assets that belong to one country but are in other countries. Because I think up to now the conversation has sort of always centered around illicit financial flows, where the money being talked that is in question is a proceed of crime, right? Whether it be corruption, terrorism, whatever the case may be. That's the kind of those are the kind of assets that prior to this the conversation of what should be done with frozen assets has centered around. But here we are talking about legitimate assets that are frozen, not because of any legitimacy in their kind, but as a punitive action towards something unrelated that the country in question is being accused of. So definitely this deal is going to it forms now part of a broader conversation that does not just focus on the issue of illicit financial flows in the global market. Yeah.
Right. Now, when we were speaking earlier, we spoke about also how this, it translates to say that the war is going to be extended. We are speaking now of more years, maybe months, you never know.
Yes.
So what does this also imply also in the economic front of things? What can we expect in the near future? How is this going, the extended war, how is it going to affect the different countries now? Low economy countries, middle economy countries, high-end level economies. How is this going to come into play in the different markets and different countries?
Well, I think the even from when the war first started, the biggest effect of the war was the disruption to the food networks around the world, and specifically in Africa, where we saw a disruption to the grain supply, considering Ukraine's role in the global grain supply. So when the war erupted, there was that disruption, and with the war continuing, it means that same problem persists. Even the African countries that were at the peace summit that I mentioned earlier, they continued to talk about that fact that the biggest effect of the war on Africa and the rest of the developing world has been that disruption that it caused on the global grain supply and sort of other related food products. So we can, with the continuance of the war, we can expect the continuance of that shortage and shock in prices. But of course, we've seen that Russia, as a way to appealing to African countries, sort of came in to try and soften the blow. When we had the Russia-Africa summit towards the end of last year, I think, you know, or was it at the beginning of the year, the Russian president, you know, pledged grain to some of the African countries that were there as a way to sort of, you know, a peace offering that I understand that I'm engaged in this war that is now having this trickle-down effect on your country in the form of food shortages. So as a sort of a peace offering and as a way of ameliorating that secondary effect to you, here are some grain supplies that I'm handing out to those countries. So that's definitely going to continue to be a problem because, like I said, that was a once-off at the summit. That problem persists now, and it will persist as the war continues. The same goes for the issues of the supply of oil and the like. So as much as we are seeing that those different economic chains and trade linkages, as much as we see that they have been resilient in the two wars that this war has been happening, they have not been without needing countries to sort of think around them and, you know, make compromises and settlements here and there. So I think that's something that's definitely going to persist, and we might find that with some countries they might start running out of ideas to try and make up for some of these trickle-down effects that they're experiencing. Because when the war first started, a lot of countries were expecting that these measures that they are employing would be short-term. This is just in the short term. But I think over time they are realizing that there is nothing short-term about that war. So they now have to start thinking long-term about addressing these secondary effects of the war that are coming onto them. And like I said, considering with Africa the problems that we have with intra-African trade, it means that we need to start focusing more seriously on those. We have been focusing on them for a while now. I don't know the effects that the extent to which we can say we have been successful, but it might now be time to stop focusing on talking about the problem of intra-African trade and now start actually addressing it, because now we're at a point where we see continued negative effect as a result of decisions that happen outside of Africa. Yeah.
Right. Actually, that was going to be my last question towards you. Maybe you can just briefly summarize that to hear from you from an expert's point of view. What must be done? What can be done? Us in Africa, what can we do, you know, to mitigate the effects of these wars? Volatility of prices is going to continue to be there with these wars, in as much as we keep on relying on this other big economies. So from your point of view, what would you say should be done? What can be done?
Well, I think the one of the main reasons that Africa is unable to deal with the issue of intra-African trade, the issue of transport within Africa, the high transport cost. A lot of these problems circle down to peace and security within the continent, right? Yeah. So and this has been overdue for years now. The issue of addressing conflict in the African continent by the AU. You know, we saw, I think, last year as well, when some African presidents went to Ukraine and Russia as sort of one way that they are trying to broker peace between the two. And the question at the time was, how are they able to prioritize a war that is far removed from the continent, although we are experiencing, like we said, some trickle-down effects of it, when they have actual active wars, not just a wars on the continent itself. So when you look at any problem relating to Africa, whether it's from a political viewpoint, a social viewpoint, it almost always boils down to peace and security on the continent. So that's the biggest issue that we need to deal with, so that when that is established, the issue of movement can then be sorted, because a lot of the times we are so closed off from each other because we are afraid of carrying the burden of other countries that are not experiencing peace and security, right? That's why we have the issue of immigration and border control. Once we sort the peace and security aspect out, we can then now address the issue of trade. Some countries are cut out of the intra-African trade links because, again, they are in turmoil. It means those countries can be integrated within the trading system. If you look at a country like DRC, it has been in conflict for years now, and as a result, it is unable to participate fully within the African trade market. But it is one country that, if it were to achieve lasting peace, would account for a lot of prosperity as it relates to trade within the African continent. And then we talk about movement of people and goods. And then that is when now we can see progress in all of these other aims and aspirations that we have for Africa.
Right. I think what I take from you, Sonia, is that basically, or simply put, to stop the wars and Africa rise up and unite.
I guess
right.
you could put it succinctly to say that.
Right. Well, thank you so much for making time to be with us once again, Sonia. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much for having me. It's always a pleasure.
Right. Like she was saying, Africa unite, rise up and unite. Motweetso a re kopane gape in a very short while. Wetso re leboga go bontse weekantse rona dikgang tsa rona di a tswelela le kalana la melemo la BOTSWANA le letse le tshwere ditshupo tsa melemo mono ga borone. Tona wa botsogo Dr. Edwin Dikoloti